Hello, everyone. I am Neal, and I'm here today to talk about how Russian cyber is, in my opinion, offensive. And we're going to focus on looking at the recent cyber operations conducted by Russia in early 2022, really focused in February before the ground invasion, specifically February 13th through 16th. I want to give a first shout out to the team that helped me put this together. They were working with me on a quick time crunch to gather the data, do the analysis, and get that report out so that we could contribute to the larger community as well as harden U.S. and allies from any other future Russian attacks. So for today, there's been a lot of events in 2022. January 13th, we started with Whispergate. Then what we're going to focus on today, the denial of service against the Ukrainian banks and the Ukrainian government on that same day, February 14th, when it was reported in the news through February 16th. There was Hermetic Wiper, all the way down through March. And then we've even seen what we'll cover right at the end is on March 28th, a BGP hijack that was surrounding Twitter and some Russian telecom providers. So to start off here, the goal was we're going to look at the event that occurred on February 15th. It was public knowledge that the Ukrainian government sites were down for about 4 hours, and the banks, the two large banks in the financial sectors for the Ukraine, were down, were taken offline. And everybody immediately thinks Russia, right? Given the tensions, the political tensions over there. Ukraine did report this. Researchers were able to see it publicly posted on Twitter with spikes in BGP routing, network outages, and things like that. But that was really it. There was reporting at that big day, hey, Russians are doing this, and then it really died off. There wasn't much reporting, follow-on research. There was a few small events that were reported and seen. They didn't get any real public attention. It was kind of, hey, there was a network outage, it's over, and then they move on. The focus of this as well was that if we can look at these kind of large scale events that we don't get a chance to see very often, that are so public and known, we can better understand the tools and the tradecraft of those tier one adversaries, and in this case Russia, and then use that to work back, kind of a know thy enemy approach to defense. So if you understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, based off of previous attacks and things like that, previous tradecraft. Humans are creatures of habit. They have military orders of battle, and we can use that to better harden ourselves in the future. So that was our approach for this endeavor. The open source reporting was good. It's interesting to see that pop up in the news. However, it was just the February 15th, and then it was kind of done. They didn't really dig any deeper. Yes, the outage was there. The Ukrainians kind of fought back and put it together, and then didn't have anything else. And they did publish a list of botnets. It was about 60 IPs. I think about 80 if you go through the whole community that were, hey, these are the IP addresses that the government of Ukraine could see because it was their systems that were hitting them. And they were, let's look back at these and profile them. They were all part of a variant of the Mirai botnet and some other low-level common botnets that were used and controlled likely by Russian military forces to support that offensive operation. But we look at it, and I think we need to go a little deeper into how it occurred. Was there anything that happened beforehand? Was there anything that happened afterwards? What tactics were used? If we could understand the specific details and tradecraft at a technical level, maybe we could thwart that attack or kind of, pull the switch on it right as it's starting to happen. Also, were there any indicators that this was coming, that they had to prep, that they had to get something in place hours before, even minutes, anything that would give us an edge to better defend against it? And then how can we stop these from happening in the future if we can configure or put things in place that would nullify their tactics without them being able to know that or adapt? And then how do we see this as early as possible? Knowing earlier is better. We started to pull the data together. So with these analytic questions, we brought in global net flow. We brought in passive DNS records. We brought in BGP history and routing updates surrounding that time period. It was about 122 million records in total. that we brought in to look at. A lot were the PDNS and a lot were the net flow, but that's what our team kind of used. We went all the way back to December 1st in order to give a good baseline and a profile leading into February, and then we went as far as we could into March, but we cut it off right at the end of February for the research here as we were turning out the report at the beginning of March. All right, so once again, this was a great graphic that we were able to pull together, that the team was able to pull together. Fantastic here. So we've got on the top all of the larger events that occurred, political and diplomatic. We've got cyber, military, but the big piece at the bottom, you've got the graph that is more than just eye candy, I can assure you. What that is depicting at the bottom, we're lining up by time the events in public news, whether it be troops moving on the battlefield or a cyber event or Parliament in Russia making a move with technical data. So we've got that spike on Monday the 14th. That was a PDNS attack that we were able to witness. Didn't have any news events, kind of stands alone, but it was definitely an anomalous behavior coming right in on February 14th against the banks. And then we also, you can see the surge in blue right around February 15th into 16th. That's the high volume DDoS that we all saw in the news, but you can see how long it lasted and then when they eventually turned it off. So it's really exciting to see not only what we expect to see from the news, but we confirm that with technical data. The one key piece that I would pull out here is that red spike was a very directed attack, and we'll go into the details, but that was 24 hours prior to, you can see in purple on the 15th of February, when the Russian parliament identified the separatist states as states and recognized them, which kind of opens up the gates for Russia taking action in the Ukraine, and they're not part of Ukraine and sovereign there. So, but that was an action 24 hours prior to the legislative body identifying it. So Putin and the military were actually taking what I believe we all will classify as offensive military cyber operations before their legislative body had kind of recognized it separately. So that action, independent of the legislative body, is just it's interesting to see from a perspective with technical kind of evidence. So that's something we were able to pull out by doing this kind of time phase analysis. The three big events that we're going to go into today. We're going to start with the passive DNS on the February 14th, which is a day prior to the DDoS attacks. We're going to look at the DDoS attacks in detail. We pulled out a few extra nuggets when we looked at it, and then the BGP manipulation of the Twitter hijack and the BGP manipulation at the end of the DDoS on February 15th. So when we put all these together and dissect them back, we're able to start seeing the toolkit that Russia was using for their operations. So for the first event, first siege that we would call it, what we've got on the screen here, the graph is the passive DNS data. So passive DNS by volume, and I do want to highlight that this is a log graph. So any type of scale is an increment up is an exponential change. So it's really significant to see such a spike on a log scale for this data. So the key piece is that we saw behavior is that at 09 Greenwich Mean Time, which is actually 12 o'clock Moscow time, there was that drastic increase, as you can see in that blue spike on the graph. So it kind of like high noon, Russia kicked it on, and the DNS traffic that we collected in two parts. So we had the dedicated services, which are in green, and those were like the IPs dedicated to the banks that are owned by the banks. They're within their ASN, within the Ukraine. And then both banks were also leveraging cloud-based services, and the predominance of them were supported by Amazon, and they were in Ireland at one of the data centers there. So we collected both, but then looked at them separately because they had different behaviors when we were approaching it. But we saw this massive increase, an exponent of 1 million times more than what was normal for the previous 60 days, starting on the dot at 9:05 or 9 to 9:05 based on the collection sensor variance of time. So, but I mean, it's amazing to see that type of scale come in right away. I don't think we don't assess, like nobody was checking at that time to see what actually happened, but there was no reported outages, and they turned it off pretty quick after that. But as you can see, the spikes are normally what you see when somebody's doing the DNS enumeration or things like that. So if a red team comes in, they're using a word list and trying to enumerate a network. This is what it looks like. So they're not as sneaky as people normally think they are. But you'll see the word list with DNS. You can, in plain text, you can kind of see it. On here, they weren't actually just coming in and using a word list, and it wasn't a pen test or something like that. They were sending messages in the word list. So we remember from the Hermetic Wiper malware, they actually put in, hey, here's the White House and Biden, President Biden, sending that kind of message in the malware, hard coding that. I think they also were doing that here. You could see that it says ODE, VIP Corp, like very important corporation, VIP, very important point, 0 day to your address, private bank. So they're not only sending an overwhelming attack as an intention. They're kind of like writing a message on the missiles as they shoot them, just like fighter pilots write missiles on the bombs that they drop. This is definitely a tactic and a telltale sign of a premeditated military operation and not just a kind of lower level attack. What we did next was we took that time period and we're zoomed in. Instead of looking at the couple days there, we zoomed right into that 9 o'clock to noon on the day of February 14th. And what we saw here, we broke it out into 5-minute intervals, once again on a log scale. But in the middle of it, it was kind of interesting to see there was an 18-minute gap. So they were on doing the DNS enumeration at a large scale for about an hour and a half. Stopped or an hour, stopped for 18 minutes, and then started back up again. So, as you're conducting a DDoS, it's interesting to see. It's hard to do. It's not as easy as people think. And so, we don't know why this blur, this kind of stoppage came into play. Could have been the Russians kind of broke their own botnet, had to reboot it, had to get it going again. Could have been the Ukrainian banks were responding to this attack and started a shift in load balance and took their systems offline and booted them back up. It may have taken the systems offline and then they came back up. I don't know. But it is interesting to see that there was this gap and then it turned back on again. So we will see stops and starts again. So I do think it might be on the Russian side of things where they're coordinating this attack, trying to sustain it. It's very difficult. You don't know how the network's going to react until you actually do it. So there's a lot of adjustments as you're conducting these operations. So this is what I pictured on that day when they tried for 3 or 4 hours and nothing really happened. There wasn't a large-scale outage. So somebody had to call President Putin and tell him that it did not work and we need a new plan. So that's what I picture. I hope you all have that same piece in mind. But we'll move into the second day, the second siege, what I would maybe call Plan B. So they turn to a distributed denial of service attack against the dedicated IP space on the 15th. Once again, starting around high noon with Russia, it started to ramp up in Moscow time. So kind of the same piece, high noon military operation. Let's kick it off. Let's go. Once again, a log scale, and we saw that exponential increase from about a 10,000 piece volume, and then that really went up to right at 1 million times what was there previously. So a drastic increase in volume at a very specific time, and we saw that sustain. You can see that sustained for about 30 hours. It was there, and then it just turned off. So with the DDoSes, you turn it on. You try to keep it going. You make some network tweaks, but then you turn it off. They're very hard start and stops. Very easy to see. So we'll discuss the BGP event in detail on the following slides. But we saw the public reporting that they were offline for about 4 hours, but we see the traffic here for 30. So once again, I feel like somebody had to give him a call or face to face and say, Vlad, it didn't work. And then he says, "Niet. We're going to go to Plan K and try something else." So they're going to continue to escalate in that same pattern for finding something that will bring down the Ukrainian targets that they're trying to take down. The last event that we're going to cover in detail is the BGP manipulation. So that occurred at a very specific time on that red line, about 1300 Greenwich Mean Time on February 16th. So in the final volley of their denial of service attacks, there was a notice and publicly reported BGP stream hijack at 1330, where the traffic routed differently, the paths were changed, and there was definitely a disruption in the operations. It didn't necessarily take the sites offline again, but it was once again it was a notice network event. But the key piece that I would like to highlight is that though the preferred routes were in green, and then you can see the alternate route once the prefix was announced and the hijack occurred in red. This goes against every BGP rule that is out there. So it added a hop into the path for no reason. So it's definitely a forced action that they took. This was a Nigerian provider that just announced the IP space for the Privat Bank. So it really had no purpose. It had to have been an intentional manipulation. It just did not happen to occur by accident. If this had been for load balancing purposes, we would have seen a loss of volume or loss of traffic before the event, the load balancing shift in place, and BGP across the internet react and propagate a different route, and then the traffic coming back online. As you can see, it was very, very quick. It sustained at a certain level, and then it went up and peaked again at a factor of 1,000 times what it was previously before, which was already over 1 million times what it was previously. So we're just talking about huge loads of traffic relative to a previous baseline. And it defaulted to a carrier with Russian ties. So the Telia character is all over Europe. It's one of the largest, but they have in Eastern Europe started recently in 2017, 2018, alliances with the Russian government, providing Russian services and enabling that sort of Eastern European, areas that are affiliated with and pro Putin and pro Russia. So that's not a surprise, but that also just indicates, hey, look, this was an action that was an intentional for disruption. And the crazy piece, if you want to put on a little bit of a tinfoil hat, is the only other time that we saw this type of route change from the traditional in green to adding Telia as 1299 ASN into the route for the Privat Bank and the other Ukrainian banks was on January 19th. And on January 19th, there was a visit from the U.S. The U.S. Secretary of State came to Ukraine on that day to meet with the president of Ukraine. So that's also, a big show of political force from the United States going to Ukraine to meet with their president, given the heightened tensions at this time, and seeing the route change at that point, but nothing occur. I mean, it was definitely a pre-positioning. And I'll circle back to point 3, where this route was changed at 8 in the morning, the day of the attack, but there was no impact, and the actual traffic didn't route over a path that was, announced in conflict until about 6 hours later, right? So they put the configuration in place at 08 in the morning, and then they didn't actually do what they needed to do and flick the switch until 1300 that afternoon. And then they tried for about an hour and a half before calling off the entire DDoS, in my opinion, when it went back down to 0. So that type of pre-positioning is a true indicator of that something bad is going to occur. It's like the calm before the storm kind of thing. Everything gets quiet and something bad is going to happen. You see a prefix change that starts to do this, and you add a route path. Something bad is coming. Grab the kids, run down to the shelter kind of thing. But those were some big points that came out, and this really showed what the capability that the Russians have, being able to manipulate backbone prefix announcements across an ASN across 2 different continents, and then have that route traffic for your purposes is a huge show of your placement and access, and a huge show of the power that you can have if you really want to inflict some damage going forward. So let's take a quick break. A lot has happened since February 16th. We've got a ground invasion. We've got tons of sanctions. More wiper ransomware have gone out. We've got boycotts from the West. We got boycotts from Russia, and boom, the Iron Curtain is now back up. So this is definitely a new type of landscape for the internet that we haven't really seen before, where they're kind of cutting themselves off. And I wanted to talk about some other actions that came in place at that point. So the action that we want to discuss is that there's a growing risk to U.S. businesses for the collateral damage that can come into place when the Iron Curtain goes up for the internet per se. So actions taken by a country to shelter their citizens, shelter their economy, is kind of a snuff back to the other side. So Russia trying to snuff back to the West or Western companies by blocking traffic for whatever reason, sheltering their citizens for censorship or things like that, can have ripple effects and collateral damage, or some people call cyber leakage, outside of just Russia. So they're just taking an action in Russia kind of within their bounds, but it's actually negatively impacting businesses and other citizens outside of that country. So the case study we're going to talk about was the RTCOM Twitter IP space that occurred on towards the end of March of this year. So in case this siege number 4, announcing the Twitter IP space was very interesting, where you have the normal route on the left, where you can see in red, that's Twitter's ASN. And then there's just the collector that the Cisco BGP stream has in place in blues in that red line. So that's the normal route. And then all these other ASNs on the screen there are just kind of operating as normal. They'll find the least path of least resistance, and they'll go to Twitter to do their thing. On the right, you see when it was hijacked at a very specific time on that day, you can see all the routes are going through. In the center there, that's a Russian telecom provider, and then you have RTCOM for Russia as the final destination in red. That's now announcing the Twitter IP space. So essentially, everything in Eastern Europe, and some of those are Switzerland, and some of those are Africa. Those ASNs are now, instead of going to the actual Twitter website, they're going to a known bad provider with RTCOM. So that new direct route diverted all the traffic from Twitter, which is not good. So they started doing that at 12:06 GMT. Johannes Ulrich highlighted that to everyone. The question is, did this affect users outside of Europe? It really didn't. The BGP routes, for people in the U.S. or Japan, they still got to Twitter because they weren't going to go to Europe and then go back to the U.S. Did this event impact businesses outside of Eastern Europe? So, conclusion, yes and no. So there are some businesses that leverage that IP space for their operations within Twitter legitimately. So if they were doing business with Eastern European customers, they lost that business. They couldn't go there. They were going to the Russian website and not to the actual Twitter one. And then also, but the other sites, if they're the customers that are not in Eastern Europe, if they're not doing business there, they're not going to really see that impact. We also asked, was this a configuration error by accident? So very unlikely. I mean, given the current conflict in Ukraine, it's most likely that they did intend to do this. And also, too, this wasn't the first time that this exact IP block was hijacked at all. It was also hijacked in the Myanmar coup d'etat last year in February. It was hijacked during that to kind of shelter those citizens from using social media against the government. So it's not the first time it happened. Russia was also very pro-Myanmar coup d'etat with political support, financial and military. So they I don't know if they gave them the idea and then they used it themselves, or they helped test it, but kind of odd to see it happen twice in the same IP block at the same kind of political contesting times. But we'll leave that for further discussion at another time. So why does this type of sinkhole or BGP hijack matter? As more Western businesses are publicly boycotting Russia and backing out and divesting their pieces there, Putin and the Russian government are definitely getting angry and retorting back. Putin has even said he's called it an act of war. In retaliation, Russia putting on our tinfoil hats here, what could happen and has started to. Russia starts a boycott back to the West, not allowing citizens to go to those sites. So how they do that, they have their iron curtain up and they just block and sinkhole that IP traffic. They announce it. They know that there's a conflict, but there is no like legal repercussions for announcing specific IP space right now. That's not yours. Russia decides to start announcing a lot of IP space for anti-Russian companies. So they just start blasting this out so that their users can't go to the legitimate sites, because if you're in Russia and you're trying to go to a site in Germany or in the US, you have to pass through Russian stuff and they'll just divert you off to the side. So, I mean, they could also escalate, as they've done in the past, as we saw with the DDoS and the PDNS, they escalate their attacks over time. And if they did want to escalate, they can alter the lower tier tables and providers with smaller IP spaces, and that will likely have a negative impact across the board, widespread, if they really wanted to cause that type of problem. So I used a case study in 2019, like big providers. We're talking about the big ones out of San Francisco, Amazon, Cloudflare, Facebook. They were offline for a couple hours because a small ISP incorrectly announced their IP blocks, and it was propagated up. So that was truly an accident, but like, I put this out there, like, who would win against a small ISP, right? If you put Russia and Russian APT against a small scale ISP, any of them, Russia's just got to find one, and then they can do this large scale disruption. So it's a fairly, it's a growing threat. I think it's something to start to think about and look into. The actions that Twitter had in place did minimize the impacts. They had some pieces in place that authenticate your IP blocks across the routing chain so that they don't go. It's called RPKI, and that protects your IP space from getting hijacked by somebody else, so that the damage is minimal. But those types of recommendations would go into place to harden your network, as this is a real threat coming from the Russians. So the big piece to take away from this is that the threat actor, Russia in this case, definitely did escalate their pieces over time. Their attacks were largely unsuccessful from what we could see, other than the 4-hour outage. The PDNS attack did not overwhelm the servers, but they did follow on actions and increase their kind of weaponry stores there. They did that denial of service attack. The devices that they use, we found a bunch more as part of those botnets, about another 50. But they were all, small compute, microtics, IP cameras, things like that can't really provide that compute and that firepower to take things down. So they will likely, maybe shift to using just purchased cloud-based infrastructure moving forward. The shift and the final kind of like volley that they did do, the BGP manipulation, which is like the huge piece that shows your access, shows your control, and shows your ability to really manipulate, the backbone portions of the internet. Is something to be highlighted and concerned about as a new tactic and a new method for military cyber operations. What did we learn? Ransomware will always still be the weapon of choice. They were effective. They will likely still be used in the future again. But these other attacks are becoming more prolific, and I think they're going to learn and evolve from theirs as well. As I said before, they're unlikely going to leave the large-scale botnets to anonymous. They're really good at getting those to be effective DDoS tools and mechanisms. Military might not be the best to do that, so using the cloud providers and making sure that you can have like a 16-core CPU, high-powered CPU cloud from Amazon or something like that to use in your operations, rather than try to leverage a small-scale IP camera. I do think, and as we've seen before, as we were assessing at the beginning of March, that their internet backbone attacks are going to become more prolific, and those are going to be a growing tool in the toolbox and a weapon of choice. We did see that with Twitter, 28 days later. So with what Russia was doing, so that is definitely a growing threat and a piece where we can take actions to harden before the shields really go up for the next large offensive. But I know that was a lot. I appreciate everybody's time today. Would love to follow up with any questions in the chat or offline. Please find me on Twitter and things like that. I'd love to keep digging in, and hopefully this was all helpful for everyone, kind of piqued your interest, and then also you might leave here with a few new pieces of tradecraft or approaches that you can apply in your analysis and hardening your network. Thanks again. Have a great day.